So what we have as a goal in terms of thinking about the archive in the broader terms is, thinking of these community archives to document, preserve, and disseminate stories of Afro-Caribbean communities in the coast in Costa Rica. And as Kay was mentioning, documentation has been already created or found, but it's still a process. So it's not like a fixed archive, like we'll just collect stuff, create an archive. This is kind of a continuous idea of thinking about archives from that perspective. So that's kind of the steps in which we are right now in terms of just having conversations about how to connect both the legal situation in terms of the rights, land rights, and also the importance of disseminating the community's histories and collective memories.
Can you describe how can this particular community, which is English-speaking, Costa Rica, is connected? I mean, because there's Belize and Guatemala and Costa Rica. Can you kind of, how did this mushroom?
So it is part of Costa Rica. It is politically within the boundaries of Costa Rica. Communities there received citizenship in 1948 with the new constitution, which also the same constitution abolished the military in Costa Rica. There was a big sort of change. And that was the first time that they were recognized as citizens of Costa Rica. But, I mean, to give you an idea, up until I think the late 50s or 60s, Afro-Caribbean Costa Ricans still needed a special permit to travel into the Central Valley. So there is a history of segregation and racial discrimination, which you definitely still see to this day, and I've witnessed firsthand. But politically speaking, they are a member of Costa Rica, and the issue of land rights particularly impacts them because their communities were established, these communities were established essentially right on the coastline because they were founded by turtle fishermen and coconut farmers. And they came from a background, they came mainly from Jamaica and Panama, from cultural backgrounds that live very much right on the coastline. And in time, Costa Rica developed conservation policies that restricted development along their coastline. So the coastal zoning law, which is called La Ley de la Zona Marítimo Terrestre, was established in 1977. It's a big year. And it restricts development within the first 200 meters. The first 200 meters from the high tide line encompasses the majority of many of these communities in terms of the structures, the homes and businesses that exist there. A large part of those establishments were sort of grandfathered in if they existed before the law, but at the same time, the law wasn't enforced for like 20, 25 years, up until really like the early 2000s, they decided that they really wanted to enforce this. So there's definitely an element of injustice in terms of expectations for what could be done within certain areas and the zoning and how it was actually regulated, and the knowledge that people had about what laws affected their land. And there's been a lot of uncertainty about the law affecting their land. There's also a National Wildlife Refuge, which was established in 1985. That encompasses a much larger area of these communities and also goes inland and extends out into the water. And that was, when it was established, was founded with the approval of the communities, with the agreement that it would be a mixed refuge that would allow for people to live within the refuge, and there would be a plan for co-management. So anything that happened within the refuge was decided between a joint group of citizens who lived within the refuge, government officials, and with advice from experts from the outside world, international environmental NGOs, scientists, you name it. There was a lot of input into this thing, and it operated very, very successfully for about 10 years. And it was even like a model for the rest of the world. People would come in to see how natural resources could be co-managed by community members, and I believe this was called the Talamanca Initiative, and it was wildly successful until 2005, I believe. The Costa Rican government suspended it with very little explanation. I think their cited reason was that there wasn't enough scientific investigation done into the impacts of this management plan, and they didn't replace it with anything, and the area has basically been in sort of a legal limbo since then. They've rescinded the issuance of use permits, so people are pretty much unable to do anything with their land legally at this point. So the effect that has on economic development, should go unstated. It's been very difficult for people to pursue meaningful livelihoods in the area. So these communities are really caught between the need and desire on their own part to conserve their natural resources with the obvious need to provide for their families and pursue meaningful livelihoods. And that's the biggest struggle that they're facing. And I think from a lawyer's perspective and from an academic perspective, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's also a question that has largely been unaddressed by international law. So part of this process as well is to try to create local narratives that can then be connected to those bigger questions that will impact other communities far beyond just this particular instance, and to really try to inform the decision making about laws that try to balance rights against one another, specifically when we're talking about rights to conservation versus rights to development and culture and livelihood.
And part of the archive is to also document that history of the efforts.
Yes, exactly.
The legal efforts in terms of documentation, in terms of the process.
And the history that these communities have for environmental preservation on their own accord. I mean, one thing that makes this seem ultimately really unfair is that the whole reason there was able to be a national wildlife refuge in this area is because these communities had taken care of their resources so well for centuries, because their cultural traditions were very much one of stewardship with their environment. And so it's really important to document that as well, because I think that from a legal standpoint builds a much stronger case for creating a right to this land through their stewardship.
Yeah.
I have two questions, which I don't know how much time you have. But one is, I would love to hear more about the process of sort of getting to know the community and establishing a basis of like trust and free-flowing information, especially given that he was talking about how there were different groups that were coming in and kind of harvesting whatever sort of energy and access they could. And then also, if you could speak to some of the issues around creating a digital archive when most people don't necessarily have access to the technologies that would allow them to use it in the way that we understand.
Right.
Great questions.
First.
I'll speak to the first question. So I was really fortunate when I was there on co-op to be working with a local attorney who is actually from Boston originally, but has been living within these communities for 25 years. So she's been very actively involved in a lot of community-driven efforts and campaigns on a number of issues. She helps run a clean energy co-op that is all community-driven. She's very involved and has meaningful, long-standing relationships with many people in the community. So that was basically my initial source of access to community members and continues to be my largest trust-building factor. The fact that Emily Ozell introduces me to someone, it takes out a lot of effort on my part to have to build a relationship with people and to build trust. So that's been a huge reason for what we've been able to do so far. And she is also an advisor to the project, and another advisor to the project, which is another way that this is really, we're trying to push this as much as possible into the hands of the community to drive its formation, is by bringing on local advocates to really advise the project. So one such person that so far has agreed to be an advisor to the project, his name is Edwin Patterson. These students over here are law students at Northeastern, and they were able to Skype with Edwin a few weeks ago. Edwin is a native of Puerto Viejo, is a huge community advocate, local business owner, and actually ran for Congress in the early 2000s, I believe 2004, on one of these land rights issues, with the purpose of getting a law passed that would declare these towns, two of these towns involved as cities. That was one attempt that was made to try to regularize the titling process over coastal areas, which ultimately failed. It was challenged and failed on constitutionality grounds, which I'm happy to talk to more or separately later because it gets complicated. But basically, he has been working on these issues for years and years and years, and he's agreed to be an advisor on the project, and he's very well connected. Basically, everybody in most of these communities either knows him or knows who he is. So that's another way. And one of the goals for our on-the-ground work this winter is to really expand into the community and get people on board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier. Like when I first got involved, at first I was thinking in terms of how to do this, but then I just went back because basically, one of the things is what you mentioned in terms of not just, one is, trust building, but and not being like your mentions, like just showing out like, yeah, this is okay. In the web, but to actually look into ways of, for me in these early stages, for example, we're just having conversations of, for example, planning during next semester, sometime next semester, for me to actually go to Costa Rica and speak with, and just spend time in the communities, and that will help me more. And that's something that I really, I wanted to do it, definitely. And I think it's integral when thinking about building archives, regardless if it's digital or physical space, but to be involved and be experienced in the community and get a good sense of how as an archivist can be a collaborator, not just a creator of an archive, but a collaborator to their goals as a community, and regardless, in terms of the types. I think also the idea of, so there's this balance that using the archive or building an archive for the communities, for their use, for their dissemination. There's also another layer, actually, of building an archive for, disseminating their stories beyond their communities. Since the case involved these legal issues, also can be seen as some sort of a, I would not say a case study, but or model, but some way of, this is not, land rights is not unique of Talamanca. It goes, internationally over the place. So kind of big picture. Maybe this documenting, disseminating this beyond can help other communities that we don't know about right now, or in other countries and to deal with similar issues. So
yeah, it's really thinking about, like, as we develop our model for the work we're doing, of thinking about ways that it can be replicable within other communities. Mm-hmm. Either this organization continues this work in other communities, or we create tools that other advocates can use, and a model that people can follow in terms of combining different disciplines and different ideas about how to enhance a community's access to information and therefore access to justice, and how those tools can be combined to create a more meaningful experience and hopefully a better outcome.
Yeah. So that's the plan. I will, to travel and
but that is a constant concern.
It's a constant, He's constantly thinking about it. Yeah, definitely. So very valid and real concern to make sure that it's not just.
And it's an interesting balance too of thinking about the work that we do on the ground in Costa Rica, connecting with the community, putting as much as we can this process into their hands to drive its formation, but also being within a system that has the resources, and mostly resources in terms of human capital and financial capital, to make something like this happen. And that's sort of why we're bridging Boston and Costa Rica, because on the ground there are plenty of people who are working on these issues and care deeply about these issues, but it's really a matter of organizing the different efforts that are going on and providing whatever piece is missing currently to help make that bring about some sort of real systemic change.
Yeah.
Those are big questions, I don't have the answers to them. I think that's part of the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, are you guys trying to digitize anything right now, as far as like the actual records that people have, or how do you roll that out there?
there's a possibility again that we're thinking in terms if we eventually build a digital archive in terms of that goal of disseminating those stories. And as I mentioned, this is a process already. There's documentation going on because even kind of more internal ways, like all this documentation has been created, how it's organized, how it's stored, and all this, this archive is important. So it's part of the process. One thing that also I'm interested in when I want to get there on the ground and look more is this other aspect of how communities use records, because they'll have pictures of members of communities with folders of official documents or copies of documents. So what those documents tells about their stories and how that connects to the bigger issue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing we have been thinking to see what is the sense we get from the community.
So the road that was built, that's like really what connected them to the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Like before, it was just like they pretty much, like I guess like how involved were they with the government or the officials of Costa Rica before the road was built? Like, did they have some sort of autonomy with the government, or there's more like, oh, there's just some people living along the coast, but we really don't get involved with them very much until this road was built?
I think there's a real sense that like the Costa Rican government for a long time didn't really even necessarily know that there were people living along the southern Caribbean coast. I mean, it's rainforest up until the coast, and so it's a very, without a road connecting it, it's a very isolated place. And to really get there, you would come by boat. So, I mean, in terms of timeline, there's a story in this book about a Costa Rican president getting shipwrecked, I believe in 1910 or 1915, and discovering the town of Coweta. Didn't even know it was there before. And they rescued him, and so in exchange for rescuing him, he provided some government services to the town that he was totally oblivious of before. So, I mean, that's something that happened. It's not just like a story. But that's illustrative of the sense of isolation of these communities.
Yeah, so there really isn't a lot, I guess, there isn't really a lot of official government documents about, like, there's not really anything in, like, say, the Costa Rican archive about this community or anything.
Well, up until a certain point of time, there wouldn't have been, but after a certain point of time, you'll start seeing it.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that's that brings up a really good point, is there is a national archive in Costa Rica that will be important for us to do some digging in and see what there is and see what's missing. Yeah.
Is there any, I guess I've heard about indigenous communities, dispossessed communities making connections across sort of national boundaries and things to kind of connect with other communities who are also going through similar situations or have gone through similar situations to kind of understand better their own context and strategies for working, towards some kind of self-determination.